The afternoon had been quiet. One of those slow Saturdays where families drifted between exhibits, children pressed their faces against glass, and the zoo felt almost peaceful, the kind of ordinary that you stop noticing. I was near the elephant house when I heard the first shout. Not a child's shout. An adult voice cracked wide open with something that sounded less like fear and more like disbelief. Then someone ran past me, then three more people, and then the words cut through everything else. The gorilla got out. I remember the exact moment my feet stopped working. I stood there on the stone path while the world around me rearranged itself into pure chaos. Strollers being pushed at a half-run, a zoo map fluttering to the ground, a security guard pressing his radio so hard to his mouth I thought he might swallow it. Somewhere behind me a child was crying. Somewhere ahead people were scattering in every direction except forward, and forward is where he was. I saw him before most people realized what they were seeing. A silverback gorilla, and I want you to understand what that means before we go any further. Not a chimpanzee, not something small. A silverback male, 400 pounds of muscle and history, standing in the middle of the main pathway as casually as if he'd always belonged there. His name, I would learn later, was Koba. But in that moment he was simply the largest living thing I had ever seen standing on open ground outside a cage, and my mind could not fully accept that what I was looking at was real. What I expected, what every instinct in my body was braced for, was aggression, a charge, teeth, the kind of violence you read about in incident reports and wildlife documentaries narrated in hushed, respectful tones. That's the story my nervous system had already started writing. But Koba wasn't charging. He was walking slowly, almost carefully, his enormous arms swinging just slightly with each step, his massive silver-streaked back rising and falling with a calm that felt completely out of place. He stopped once and lifted his broad face toward the sky, nostrils open, reading something in the air that the rest of us couldn't smell. Then he moved again, steady, deliberate, like a man who has just stepped outside to look for something he left in the yard. That's when the strangeness of it really settled in, because the gorilla wasn't behaving the way fear told us he should. He wasn't reacting to the screaming or the running. He wasn't startled by the radio's crackling or the guards shouting. He just kept moving, scanning slowly from side to side. And there was something in the way his eyes moved, unhurried, searching, that stopped feeling like danger and started feeling like something else entirely. What was he looking for? The zoo director's voice came over the public address system. Clear the pathways, move to the nearest building, do not run. The words were calm but the voice underneath them wasn't. I had backed myself against a concrete wall near a snack kiosk, and I could see three members of the security team in my peripheral vision, two of them with tranquilizer rifles raised, the third on the radio, and all three of them watching the gorilla with an expression I recognized as the look people wear when a situation has moved several steps beyond their training. That's when I noticed the woman. She was standing in the middle of the path, not hiding, not pressed against a wall, just standing there, both hands resting on a wooden cane, watching Koba with the particular stillness of someone who has decided something. She looked to be in her 70s, white-haired, wearing a pale green cardigan that fluttered slightly in the wind. She was alone. Everyone around her had run, and somehow, in the confusion, no one had stopped to help her move. Or maybe she had chosen not to move. I couldn't tell. I still can't. One of the guards spotted her and shouted, "Ma'am, ma'am, you need to move away from the pathway, right now." His voice had that strained, careful quality of someone trying not to cause a worse panic. She didn't turn her head. She was watching the gorilla with an expression I couldn't read from where I stood. Koba was maybe 40 feet from her when he stopped. His head tilted, a slow, precise movement, left ear dropping slightly toward his shoulder, dark eyes narrowing. I've spent a lot of time since then trying to find the right word for the way he looked in that moment. Not alert, not threatening. The closest I can come is recognition, the particular way a face changes when something familiar surfaces through the noise. The entire zoo, it seemed, went quiet at once. The woman's lips moved. She was saying something too soft to carry, nothing more than a breath, and whatever it was she said it once and then waited. And Koba, the 400-pound silverback who had walked out of his enclosure and scattered hundreds of visitors without a moment of violence, slowly lowered his massive body to the ground, not collapsing, not sitting in confusion, deliberately the way a child sits when an adult they trust asks them to. He sat on the stone path in front of her like he was waiting. Around me I heard someone exhale sharply. I heard a guard's radio click and then go silent. I heard my own heartbeat. The woman reached up slowly and touched the side of her own face, and her shoulders moved in a way that told me she was crying before I saw the tears. Then she said it, quiet enough that I had to piece it together later from the people who'd been standing closer than I was. "I knew you'd remember me." The guards tightened their position, 3 rifles still raised. The zoo director's voice had gone completely still on the radio, and I stood there against that concrete wall trying to understand what I had just witnessed, because this gorilla, this animal who had terrified an entire zoo full of people, had sat down in the presence of one elderly woman like a child who had finally found who he was looking for. She was reaching toward him now, her hand trembling, thin, pale, moving slowly through the air toward a face that could have ended everything in a single motion, and all I could think was, how could this animal possibly remember her? What history existed between them? What could have happened, and how long ago that a gorilla would walk out of his enclosure and find one woman in a crowd, and simply sit down? I didn't know yet, none of us did, but I knew I was watching something that wasn't supposed to be possible. Her name was Margaret Holloway, and I almost didn't get to hear her story at all. The zoo's veterinary team guided Koba back toward his enclosure with a patience that bordered on reverence. No tranquilizers, no restraints, no force, just slow movement and open space, and Margaret walking alongside him the entire way, speaking quietly, her cane tapping a soft rhythm on the stone path. The security team flanked them at a respectful distance, rifles lowered now, watching in the particular silence of people who have stopped pretending they understand what they're seeing. When Koba finally crossed back through the enclosure gate, and the heavy door was secured behind him, he didn't retreat to the far side. He sat near the barrier, watching Margaret through the thick glass with an expression that made several of the staff look away. I found her afterward on a bench outside the administrative building. A zoo official was speaking to her quietly, urgently, with the slightly dazed manner of someone trying to conduct a professional conversation after experiencing something personally shattering. Margaret was nodding slowly, answering in a few words at a time, her cane propped against the arm of the bench. She looked tired in the deep way that has nothing to do with sleep. I don't know what made her agree to talk to me. I had no credentials, no camera, no compelling reason she should give her afternoon to a stranger. But when I sat down nearby and said simply that I'd been watching, that I'd seen everything, and that I didn't understand, she looked at me for a long moment, and then nodded once, the way people do when they've been carrying something heavy and have just decided quietly to set it down. She didn't start at the beginning. She started with the smell. The first thing you notice with infant primates, she said, is how much they smell like human babies. That surprised me every time, no matter how many years I did the work. Something about it gets right past your professional training and lands somewhere else entirely. She had spent 22 years as a caregiver and rehabilitation specialist at a wildlife rescue facility in Western Virginia, not a zoo, not a sanctuary in the polished public-facing sense, a working facility, underfunded and perpetually understaffed, tucked at the end of a gravel road behind a tree line thick enough that most people in the nearest town didn't know it existed. They received animals that had nowhere else to go, injured wildlife, confiscated pets, creatures pulled from situations that took weeks to describe without your voice changing. The call came on a Thursday night in late October, more than 15 years ago. Margaret had been at the facility for a long shift and was 2 hours from finishing when the phone rang. A conservation officer in the field, his voice thin with poor reception and something else she recognized immediately, the particular flatness that comes after witnessing something that cannot be undone. A family group of western lowland gorillas had been located near a wildlife corridor in transit, part of a small group that had been brought into the country illegally, intended for private sale. The details of what happened next were still tangled in a legal case that would take years to resolve. What Margaret understood that night, standing in the corridor of the facility with the phone pressed to her ear and the fluorescent light humming above her, was this: there had been violence. The adults had not survived, and there was one infant, badly injured, who needed to be somewhere warm within the hour. She drove through the night to collect him. He was smaller than she had expected. She had worked with primates before, macaques, a young chimpanzee once, several gibbons, but she had never held a gorilla infant, and the weight of him surprised her, not the physical weight, the other kind. He had a cut above his left eye that had been partially dressed in the field, and he was shaking with the fine continuous tremor she had learned to recognize as the body's response to shock. He would not look at her. His eyes moved to every corner of the transport crate, catalogued every surface, returned to the center and moved again, searching, still searching for something that was not there and would not be there again. She named him Koba that first night, sitting beside his enclosure on a folded blanket with a heating pad under the bedding, and a small stuffed animal she'd pulled from the lost and found box near the front office. She hadn't planned to name him. You weren't supposed to name them, not if the goal was eventual release or transfer. Names made things harder in a way that was difficult to explain to people who hadn't experienced it. But it was 3 in the morning and he was trembling and looking at the center of his crate with those searching eyes, and the name arrived before she could stop it. Koba, she said quietly, just to see what he would do. He turned and looked directly at her for the first time. She stayed beside him through the rest of that night and most of the following week. The facility director had given her latitude with difficult cases before. She had a particular gift, he said, for the ones that arrived already broken, and this was the most difficult intake they had ever received. The injuries were manageable, it was the grief that was not. Gorillas are not simple creatures, and infant gorillas who have lost their family group do not simply adjust. They go somewhere interior and quiet, and they stay there, and the work of bringing them back is slow and unglamorous, and requires a kind of patience that most people overestimate their capacity for until they try it. Margaret did not overestimate hers. She adjusted her shifts to align with his waking hours. She learned his specific sounds, the low, soft rumble that meant he was content, the sharp inhalation that preceded distress, the almost imperceptible shift in posture that meant he had heard something outside that frightened him. She learned not to approach directly, but to arrive and settle nearby, and let him choose the distance. She learned that he liked the sound of running water, and was calmed by it on difficult nights, that he had a specific weariness of strangers in blue clothing that she could never fully explain, that he watched her face when she ate as if trying to understand something fundamental about her intentions. After 3 weeks he began to sleep within arm's reach of the enclosure barrier, close enough that she could hear his breathing. After 5 weeks he began to watch for her arrival before she appeared, turning toward the door several seconds before she opened it, as if he had memorized the sound of her particular footsteps among all the others. After 2 months he reached through the barrier, and touched her hand, not grabbed, touched, the back of his small fingers against the back of hers, very brief, and then withdrawn. She sat perfectly still for a full minute afterward so she wouldn't disturb whatever had just shifted between them. She told me all of this on that bench outside the administrative building while the afternoon light lengthened and the zoo quieted around us. She spoke without sentimentality, which made it more affecting. She described her work the way experienced people describe difficult and important things, plainly, with precise details, without performing the emotion she clearly still carried. She had a habit of pausing mid-sentence when something she was saying caught up with her, and in those pauses I could see the years behind her eyes. Koba grew fast, faster than she was prepared for, though she had read everything and thought she understood. By the 6th month he was strong enough to make the enclosure feel small. By the 9th month the facility director was having conversations with her that she had known were coming but had been quietly hoping to delay. He was becoming too large for the rehabilitation program. He needed a permanent placement with the resources to manage an adult silverback. He needed a zoo. She understood. She had always understood. This was the work you gave everything you had, and then you stepped back and the animal went on without you. That was how it was supposed to go. She had done it before with smaller animals and it had been hard but manageable. She had believed sincerely that she could do it with Koba. The day he was transferred was a Tuesday in early spring. She had requested to be the one to accompany him to the transport vehicle, and the director had agreed. She walked beside the crate. He was quiet the whole way across the grounds, but just before the vehicle doors closed, he pressed his face against the transport grate and looked at her with those dark, searching eyes, the same eyes she had first seen scanning the corners of a crate at 3 in the morning, and she said his name once, the way she had the very first night. She told me she didn't remember the drive home. She told me she took 2 weeks of leave afterward, and spent most of it sitting on her back porch watching the tree line, and trying to locate the thought that would make it feel finished. She was still looking for that thought 15 years later. She hadn't returned to this zoo until today. She hadn't planned to come at all. She had been in the city visiting her daughter, and had simply found herself on a quiet afternoon with no particular agenda, standing at the entrance to the zoo and buying a ticket without fully understanding why. She had not expected him to still be here. She had not expected him to remember. I didn't go looking for him, she said quietly, turning her cane slowly in both hands. I just started walking, and somehow I ended up on that pathway. She looked down at her hands. And when I turned the corner and saw him standing there on the open path, I thought for just a moment that I must be wrong, that it had been too long, that animals don't hold on to things the way we want them to. She stopped, and then he tilted his head, she said, and I knew. Outside the enclosure now, even at this distance, I could see the dark shape of Koba sitting near the glass. Not pacing, not displaying, just sitting, facing our direction, patient in the way that very old grief eventually becomes patient when it has found, at last, something it was not expecting. The two of them had found each other again, and I had no framework for what I had just witnessed, except that it was real, and it was extraordinary, and it was not finished yet. The zoo director's name was Paul Garrett, and he had worked with animals for 31 years. He told me later that in those 31 years he had seen things that revised his understanding of what animals were capable of, moments that arrived without warning and rearranged something permanent in the way he thought about the creatures in his care. He said that what happened in the days following Koba's escape ranked among the 3 most significant things he had witnessed in his entire career. He said it quietly, without embellishment, The way people state things, they have stopped needing anyone else to believe. The morning after the incident, Garrett made a decision that departed from standard protocol. Instead of restricting access to Koba's enclosure while the behavioral assessment was completed, he invited Margaret back. Quietly, without announcement, without the zoo's communications team or the small gathering of local press that had appeared near the front entrance after word of the previous day's events had circulated. Just Margaret, her cane, a folding chair borrowed from the administrative office, and the long glass wall of the enclosure. I was there. I had asked if I could be, and Garrett had looked at me for a moment and then said yes in the manner of a man who has concluded that some things should have a witness. Margaret arrived at 8:30 in the morning. The zoo was not yet open to the public. The pathways were empty and the air had that particular early quality, cool and unhurried, the light still finding its angle. She walked slowly and I walked beside her, and neither of us said much. There was nothing useful to say. We both knew we were moving towards something, and the best thing was simply to keep moving. Koba was already at the glass when we arrived. I don't know how to convey this adequately without sounding like I'm reaching for effect, so I'll say it as plainly as I can. The gorilla was sitting 3 feet from the barrier, upright, facing the pathway, as if he had been waiting, not pacing, not distracted by the other members of his group moving in the background, sitting with a stillness that felt deliberate, his broad silver-streaked back straight, his dark eyes fixed on the approaching path with an attention that was, in every observable way, directed and intentional. When Margaret came into his line of sight, his posture shifted, not dramatically. The change was small enough that you might have missed it if you weren't watching carefully. A slight forward lean, a loosening in the set of his shoulders, the particular relaxation of a body that has been holding something and has just been given permission to put it down. His breathing, visible in the gentle rise and fall of his chest, changed cadence, slower, deeper. Margaret stopped in front of the glass and stood quietly for a moment. Then she lowered herself into the folding chair, slowly the way her age required, and settled her cane across her knees. She did not speak. She did not press her hand to the glass, or lean forward, or perform any gesture of reunion. She simply sat, and looked at him, and let the stillness between them be whatever it needed to be. Koba reached forward and placed one enormous hand flat against the interior surface of the glass. I heard one of the keepers behind me exhale sharply. I heard Garrett shift his weight. I stood completely still because I was afraid that any movement would disturb the particular quality of the air in that moment, which felt fragile and important in equal measure. Margaret looked at his hand against the glass. Her own hand came up slowly from her lap. She was wearing a thin cardigan again, pale yellow this time, and her hand emerged from the sleeve and moved toward the glass with the careful deliberateness of someone who understands that certain moments cannot be rushed without being ruined. She pressed her palm flat against the barrier, directly opposite his. Glass between them. 15 years between them. Everything that cannot be recovered between them. And yet, the two of them stayed like that for a long time. I stopped tracking the minutes. The morning light moved across the enclosure floor in a slow diagonal, and somewhere in the habitat behind Koba, a younger gorilla moved through the background and was ignored. Margaret's eyes were closed. Koba's were open, fixed on her face with a concentration that I had never seen in an animal before and have not seen since. Not the surveillance of a creature assessing a threat, not the vacant attention of an animal waiting to be fed, but something closer to what I can only describe as witnessing. He was looking at her the way you look at something you thought you had lost. After a while, Margaret began to speak, low enough that her words didn't carry to where I stood, which felt right. Some conversations are not for other people. I watched the shape of her mouth moving and watched Koba watching her mouth with that same concentrated stillness, and I thought about the fact that she had spoken to him like this before, in the small hours of difficult nights, beside an enclosure in a facility at the end of a gravel road, while he was learning whether the world was safe enough to stay in. He remembered her voice. I was certain of it. Not as a learned association or a conditioned response. I am not a scientist and I won't pretend to precision I don't possess, but in some way that was prior to training, older than habit. The way the body remembers warmth. Paul Garrett came to stand beside me after a while. We watched together in silence for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, "We've had Koba for 14 years. In 14 years I have never seen him sit still like that for another person. Not staff, not volunteers, not the veterinary team that's worked with him since he arrived." He paused. "He tolerates us. He's well adjusted, as silverbacks go. But this is different." He stopped again. "This is recognition." The behavioral assessment that the zoo's animal care team conducted over the following days would note in careful clinical language that Koba displayed markedly reduced stress indicators in Margaret's presence, lower cortisol levels, decreased pacing behavior, reduced vigilance response. The report used phrases like atypical comfort response and sustained affiliative behavior toward unfamiliar visitor. It was accurate as far as it went. It did not go very far. What the report could not capture was the afternoon 3 days later, when Margaret returned and brought, without quite planning to, a small container of the same protein-enriched porridge she had fed Koba in the early weeks of his recovery. She had made it from memory. She wasn't sure why. She told me she'd just found herself in her daughter's kitchen that morning doing it. She showed it to a keeper, who checked the ingredients with the nutrition team and said it was fine, and then a keeper carried it inside while Margaret stood at the glass. Koba smelled it before it reached him. He was at the far end of the habitat when the bowl was brought in. He stopped mid-movement and turned, and his nostrils worked for a moment, and then he crossed the entire length of the enclosure in a slow, direct line, and sat down in front of the bowl. He didn't eat immediately. He bent forward and smelled it again, very carefully, and then he sat back and looked through the glass directly at Margaret, with an expression that I can only describe as arriving. The look of something that has been traveling a long distance and has just recognized where it is. He ate slowly. He kept looking up at her between bites. I watched Margaret watching him, and I saw something shift in her face. Not the tearful recognition of the first day, not the quiet gravity of the morning at the glass, but something older and softer than either. The particular expression of a person who has just had something confirmed that they spent a long time being afraid to believe. A woman in her 70s, in a pale cardigan, standing at the glass wall of a gorilla enclosure in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, watching an animal she had pulled back from the edge of the world eat a bowl of food she had made from memory, and understanding, finally, that he had carried her with him all the years she thought she had been forgotten. She told me afterward that the hardest part of that day had not been the emotion of it. The hardest part had been a thought that arrived quietly while she stood at the glass, a thought she had not expected and could not immediately manage. I realized, she said, that I came here today because some part of me needed to know that it mattered. The work, all those years, all those animals you care for and release and never hear about again, you do the work because it's right, but there's a part of you that never stops wondering. She looked at her hands, whether any of it stayed with them, whether you left anything behind that was worth something. She was quiet for a moment. He answered that question, she said. After 15 years, he answered it. The days that followed were not without difficulty. The zoo's board of directors had to navigate the liability questions raised by the enclosure malfunction. An investigation would later determine that a locking mechanism had failed due to deferred maintenance, a finding that generated its own set of conversations and consequences. The small cluster of local press outside the entrance grew briefly larger, and then dispersed when it became clear that neither Margaret nor the zoo director were interested in performing the story for anyone. A few grainy videos from visitor phones circulated online for several days. Koba walking the path, the crowd scattering, the stillness when Margaret didn't move, but the footage was distant and unclear, and the moment that mattered most, the moment of the hand against the glass, had not been filmed by anyone. It remained for the people who had been present, simply true. The enclosure malfunction had given Koba an afternoon of unplanned freedom, and he had used it to find the one person he had been looking for, in the only way available to him, which was to simply walk toward the memory until the memory became real. I am aware of how that sounds. I am aware that behavioral scientists would offer more cautious language, and they would be right to, but I also know what I saw. And what I saw was a 400-pound silverback gorilla who had not laid eyes on Margaret Holloway in 15 years, recognize her in a crowd of hundreds, and sit down at her feet and wait. Some things are larger than the language we have for them. The night before I left the city, I went back to the zoo at closing time and stood outside the enclosure alone for a while. Koba was at the back of the habitat, settling into his evening routine, and he did not come to the glass. There was no reason he should have. I was no one to him, but I stood there anyway, thinking about a woman on a folding chair and a hand pressed against glass, and the particular quality of stillness that descends when two living things, separated by everything that time can do, find each other across it anyway. And I thought about all the things we carry without knowing we're carrying them, and all the things that carry us. The visiting area was Paul Garrett's idea. He told me later that it came to him the morning after Margaret's second visit, while he was writing up the incident report, and found himself stopping mid-sentence, staring at the language he was required to use. Enclosure breach, unauthorized visitor proximity, behavioral anomaly, and feeling the profound inadequacy of every word. He put the report aside and called his facilities manager and asked how long it would take to install a dedicated viewing bench adjacent to the east wall of the gorilla habitat, close enough to the glass that a person with a cane could reach it comfortably without navigating the general visitor path. 3 weeks, the facilities manager said. Make it 2, Garrett said. It took 11 days. The bench was simple, hardwood slats, a modest armrest on the right side, set at a height that didn't require Margaret to lower herself too far or rise with too much effort. There was no plaque, no formal dedication, no announcement to the press or the public. Garrett called Margaret and told her it was ready, and she drove in from her daughter's house on a Wednesday morning in early November, when the trees inside the habitat had gone amber, and the morning air had that particular cold clarity that arrives in the Northeast when summer has finally, completely surrendered. I wasn't there for that first visit to the new bench. Margaret told me about it later, over the phone, in the unhurried way she had of describing things that mattered. Careful with the details, sparing with the interpretation, trusting that the details would carry what needed to be carried. She said she arrived before the zoo opened. Garrett had given her a key card for the side entrance. She walked the empty pathway alone, her cane tapping in the morning quiet, and when she turned the corner and saw the bench set against the glass, just the bench, simple and unhurried and exactly right, she stopped walking for a moment. She didn't say what she felt standing there. She didn't need to. She said she sat down and folded her hands in her lap and looked through the glass. Koba was already at the barrier. After that, the rhythm established itself naturally, the way rhythms do when they belong to something real. Every Wednesday morning before the zoo opened to the general public, Margaret would arrive through the side entrance, walk the quiet pathway, settle onto the bench. Koba would be at the glass. The two of them would sit together for an hour, sometimes longer, in the particular companionship that exists beyond the need for activity or event. Sometimes Margaret brought things: a book she was reading, occasionally the small container of porridge that the nutrition team had now formally approved as a supplement to his diet, once a worn photograph that she held up to the glass for a long time without explanation. Sometimes she simply sat. Sometimes she talked. Koba listened with the attentiveness of someone who understands more than the words. The keepers began to notice patterns. On Wednesday mornings before Margaret arrived, Koba's behavior would shift in ways the staff learned to read: a subtle restlessness in the early hour, a tendency to position himself near the east wall, a decreased interest in the morning feeding that resolved completely once Margaret appeared at the end of the pathway. One of the younger keepers, a woman named Dana who had been at the zoo for 3 years and had worked more closely with Koba than almost anyone on staff, told me she had initially been skeptical of the whole arrangement in the way that careful animal professionals are trained to be skeptical of narratives that seem too clean. "I kept waiting for the day it wouldn't work," she said. "The day he'd be having a rough morning, or she'd arrive and he'd just not come to the glass. Animals have bad days. Relationships have bad days. I kept waiting for the ordinary version of this to show up." She paused. It never did. Every single Wednesday, without fail. She'd come around that corner and he'd be there. She shook her head slowly. "After about 4 months I stopped waiting for it to break and just started accepting it. Word spread the way word does, not through any announcement, but through the accumulated testimony of people who had seen it with their own eyes. A keeper mentioned it to a friend. The friend mentioned it to someone else. A local journalist wrote a short piece that was careful and understated, and somehow, because of its understatement, more affecting than a dramatic account would have been. People began asking the zoo about visiting on Wednesday mornings. Garrett created a limited public observation window, 30 visitors, a respectful distance, no photography flash, no crowding near the bench. The 30 spots filled within hours of being announced. People came from neighboring states, then from farther. A retired schoolteacher from Ohio, who had read the journalist's piece and driven 6 hours alone because she told a keeper quietly she had needed to see something true. A man from Georgia who had lost his wife the previous year and couldn't fully articulate why he had come except that it had seemed important. A grandmother who brought her teenage granddaughter and stood at the back of the observation group, watching Margaret and Koba at the glass, and then looked at the girl beside her with an expression the girl would not understand for another 20 years. They all came for their own reasons. They all left having seen the same thing, which was, simply, that some bonds do not require the usual conditions for survival. They do not require proximity, or consistency, or the ongoing maintenance that human relationships demand. They can go quiet for 15 years, and still be present when the circumstances finally allow for presence. The visitors stood in the cool morning air, and watched an elderly woman and a silverback gorilla sit together in their Wednesday stillness, and whatever private thing each of them was carrying, they found something in that image that addressed it. Margaret turned 78 the following spring. Her daughter organized a small gathering, family and a few close friends, and Margaret requested that the celebration be held in the morning so that she could still make her Wednesday visit to the zoo in the afternoon. Her daughter found this both completely predictable and quietly wonderful. The party ended at noon. Margaret was at the side entrance with her key card by 1:30. The years turned in the way that years do when they are being lived honestly rather than observed from a distance, not quickly, not slowly, but with the specific texture of days that have been inhabited fully. Margaret's health remained good through her late 70s. Her walks to the bench grew a little slower. The cane she had carried the day of Koba's escape was eventually replaced with a sturdier one, and then for a period with a walker that she regarded with cheerful impatience. She told me once, during one of our periodic phone conversations, that the Wednesday visits had become the organizing principle of her week, not in a heavy way, not as an obligation, but in the way that certain things become anchors, the thing around which the rest of the days arrange themselves. I spent 22 years doing work that mostly happened in private, she said. Animals came in, you did what you could. They left or they recovered or sometimes they didn't. You didn't get to know what it meant. You just kept doing it. A long pause. He's the only one who ever told me. I asked her once what she thought about when she sat at the glass. She was quiet for a while. The early days, she said finally. The facility. Those nights when he was small and frightened and I'd sit on the floor beside his enclosure because I didn't want him to be alone. Another pause. I think about how much I underestimated him. I thought I was teaching him that the world was safe. I didn't understand until much later that he was doing the same thing for me. I have turned that over many times since she said it. I keep finding new rooms in it. Koba aged as silverbacks age, gradually and with a certain gravity, his silver spreading wider across his back each year, his movements acquiring the measured quality of a creature that has learned there is no urgency in the things that matter. The zoo's veterinary team monitored him closely. His health was, by all assessments, good for his age. He remained the dominant presence in his group, though with a temperament the staff described as unusually settled, less given to display and assertion than many silverbacks, more inclined to a watchful stillness that the keepers had come to think of as simply characteristic of him. He was still going to the glass on Wednesday mornings. Margaret passed away on a Tuesday evening in late October, 3 years ago now. She was 83. Her daughter called me the following morning. She said her mother had been comfortable at the end, that she had been at home, that her last days had been quiet and unhurried in the way Margaret had always preferred things to be. She said her mother had asked her in the final week to make sure the zoo knew, to call Paul Garrett and tell him personally so that the staff could be prepared. She said her mother's last concern, characteristically, had been for someone other than herself. Garrett told me later that he received the call on Tuesday night and spent a long time sitting in his office afterward. He said he thought about how he would tell the animal care team. He thought about Dana, who had worked with Koba for years and had long since stopped waiting for the Wednesday routine to break. He thought about what Wednesday morning would look like now. He did not fully anticipate what actually happened. The following morning, which was a Wednesday, the animal care team arrived to find Koba already positioned at the east wall of the habitat. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that he stayed there, through the morning feeding which he ignored, through the period when the other members of his group moved through their routines and periodically attempted to engage him, through the time when the side entrance, visible at an angle from the east wall, would have admitted Margaret's arrival. He stayed at the glass and watched the empty pathway. The keepers did not try to redirect him. They understood what they were watching, and they gave him the space to watch it. Dana told me she stood at the back of the habitat observation area for most of that morning, close enough to see him but far enough not to intrude, and she said that the quality of his stillness that day was unlike anything she had seen in 3 years of working with him. It wasn't agitation, she said carefully. He wasn't distressed in any clinical sense. His vitals were normal. He wasn't displaying stress behaviors. She paused. He was just waiting, very quietly, the way he always waited for her. And the morning kept going, and she didn't come around the corner. Her voice was steady. He waited for a long time. He has been there every Wednesday morning since, not all day now, an hour, sometimes less, sometimes more. He comes to the east wall and faces the pathway that leads to the side entrance, and sits in his particular stillness. The keepers have stopped noting it in the behavioral log as anything requiring assessment. It has become simply part of the Wednesday morning rhythm of the habitat, as unremarkable in its regularity as the feeding schedule, as the light moving across the enclosure floor. Garrett told me he found this more difficult to sit with than the grief of the immediate loss. In some ways, the immediacy of loss has an intensity that carries you through the early period. What comes after the intensity is quieter, and in some ways heavier. There is no framework, he said, for what it means that he still goes to that wall. I've stopped trying to find one. The zoo, at Margaret's daughter's suggestion, eventually placed a small framed photograph on the wall beside the bench. It was taken on a Wednesday morning in the second year of her visits, Margaret sitting upright on the hardwood bench, one hand resting on her cane, looking through the glass at Koba on the other side. The photograph is simple and unposed and entirely itself. Margaret is not looking at the camera. Koba is not looking at the camera. They are looking at each other, which is what they always did, which is all they ever needed. Visitors pause at the photograph before they sit on the bench. Some of them spend a long time with it. Some of them arrive having read a version of the story somewhere. The articles have multiplied over the years, some careful and some less so, and stand in front of the image testing it against what they already believed about the distance between species, about the reach of memory, about whether the things we give and love leave anything lasting in the world after we are gone. I have my own answer to that last question, though I have never been able to state it in a way that satisfies me entirely. Language keeps proving insufficient, which is perhaps as it should be. What I can say is this: on a Wednesday morning not long ago, I returned to the zoo for the first time in several years. I arrived early, before the public observation window opened, and I stood alone at a respectful distance from the east wall and waited. The zoo was quiet. The pathway was empty. The morning light was that particular late autumn gold that makes everything look as if it is being remembered rather than observed. At 8:30, Koba came to the glass. He moved across the habitat floor in his slow, deliberate way and settled in front of the barrier and looked out at the pathway with those dark, searching eyes, the same eyes that had scanned the corners of a transport crate at 3 in the morning. The same eyes that had found one woman in a panicked crowd and decided without hesitation to sit down. He looked at the empty bench. He looked at the place where the pathway curves, where a person with a cane would first come into view. He sat with the patience of a creature that has been taught by someone who loved him that waiting is not the same as losing. The morning passed around him quietly. He was still there when the first visitors arrived. He is still there now, in some version of every Wednesday morning. A silverback who has outlasted the years, and the distance, and the 15-year silence, and the final silence, still going to the wall, still looking toward the place where she used to appear, still carrying, in whatever way a gorilla carries things, the memory of the woman who sat beside him in the dark, when the world had just taken everything from him and told him, in the only language that has ever really worked between species, that he was not alone. Some things do not end because the person does. They continue in the place where the love was set down, patient and still, the way Koba is patient and still, waiting at the glass in the Wednesday morning light.